G'day everyone, welcome back to the workshop. Today we're going to talk about flatness. What is it and how do we achieve it? So, flatness. Is it important? I would say yes. As a knife maker especially, flatness is incredibly important to certain aspects of knife making. Now, you can get by without true flatness, but if you want to reach that next level of makership, you want to reach Journeyman Smith or Master Smith in the ABS, or you just want to get your fit-ups much better than you can get them without it, then you're going to need to worry about flatness. Now, a lot of people equivocate flatness with parallel. So here I have a slate hone, which is exactly parallel and flat to within the thousandth of an inch. And it was custom milled this way for honing razors. I've beat it up so it's not as flat as it used to be. But flat does not necessarily mean parallel. You can have two flat surfaces that are 90 degrees to each other, two flat surfaces that are, almost parallel but not quite. So parallel is something entirely different to flatness. And that may be something that I cover in another episode. But today we're simply talking about flatness. And flatness only refers to one plane. One side, one edge, whatever you want to call it. We are only going to be concentrating on one surface, and we want to create flatness. Now, when creating flatness, you're worried about surface deviation. So you can have, a big scoop like this, which would be known as a concavity, or you can have a hump, which is a convexity. So you've got a concave surface and a convex surface. But then even on small surfaces like this, you will have small pockmarks and stuff, small concavities, and then you may have lumps which are convexities. And you need to even those out. You need to find the true flatness of an object by bringing the highs down and the lows up, or sometimes just bringing the top down to the bottom of the lows, which is what we'll be doing. Now, most of the time when you're worrying about flatness, you're going to be worrying about metals, both ferrous and non-ferrous metals, such as brass and copper and zinc and stuff like that for your bolsters and your liners and stuff like that, and steel, obviously, for your blades, your tangs, your bolster areas, and your blade flats and your ricassos especially. So, in this episode, all I'm going to be doing is talking about steel and how to get steel flat. I'm going to be using a piece of 20mm square as an example, but this can be used on any piece that you can get in contact with a surface, and we're going to do it all by hand. Okay, so here's a perfect example of what we would call when flat isn't flat. Now, relatively speaking, compared to, say, this chipped and dug out piece of wood that the vise is mounted to, this piece of steel is flat, but relative flatness is not helpful. What we want is true flatness. Now, obviously, we're not engineers. We don't need micron, flatness. We don't need it true to within a thousandth of an inch. But the closer to perfectly flat we get, the better our linkages will be. The better our mating surfaces will be. So let's start off with this piece of mild steel. This is just a piece of mild steel bar. And I'm going to make it a little less flat than it already is, just in the interest of making sure that this is a fair demonstration. And so I'm going to take this ball peen hammer and knock a couple of bumps in it. So now we have some concavities, and on the outside of those concavities we'll find some convexities as the material dishes out from it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is hog off the majority of the material. So I'm going to use a file. This is a rough cut bastard file. And I'm just going to cut the scale, and I'm trying to maintain as even a pressure as I can. The scale acts as a great reference, and if you don't have a scaled up piece, then I'll show you how you can make a reference for that. So we're just going to cut until we reach below the scale. And right there you can see we've reached below the scale, and we still have these concavities and a few pits in the center. So I'm just going to keep going. And again, trying to keep the file level. If you want your file to chalk up a little bit less, to pin up, as they say, a little less, then you can put a little bit of chalk in there, and it'll stop the filings from grabbing into the teeth as much. Because that's what causes those deep scars that you see. So I'm push filing at the moment, and while I'm trying to maintain level, you'll soon find out that this is not a good way to get flatness. So, we're getting pretty close to being below the level of those dots. Now, right now, this surface is what a lot of people would call flat. It is, relatively bump-free. There's a couple of little bumps, but it looks very flat. But if I was to take my hone and just rub it on here, hopefully you'll be able to see that, it's only making contact with the center of the bar. And that's because as I'm push filing, the natural inclination is to push down as you start the stroke and then lever up as you get more leverage with the left hand. Because as the left hand goes over, you've got more leverage at the start and more leverage on the right in the start and more leverage on the left in the end. So you end up rocking the cut no matter what you do. Unless you're using some form of jig, you're always going to be introducing some level of convexity to the face of the surface. And that means you're never going to achieve true flatness. Okay, so now we're below all of the surface deformation. The next step will be to make this more flat. Now, funnily enough, you'll be able to see the pattern of that rocking motion in the scale here, because I've removed more material on the sides than I have in the center. And that's just a natural part of working with a file. You're almost never going to get it flat. The way to counteract that, you do your roughing with push strokes. That's a very forceful stroke, and it also gets the majority of the material removed, but it's not the most accurate. Once you have the material removed, you want to flatten this surface. Now, this technique, which I'm about to show you, isn't good for dishing along a length. If you're dishing along a length, the best way to find that out is to find yourself some kind of marking solution. You can even use pencil, you can use pencil or something like that. And this is where good machinist's files work really well. You want to make sure that your file is actually flat from the shop. Place it and push. And I can see that I'm low here. All right, yep, you can see that. I'm low here, I'm contacting here, and I'm contacting here. So if I want to remove a bit of material from here, again, those push strokes, just lightly removing the marks. You don't want to touch the area where you contacted. Now, this is obviously not going to be even because of this, but if I can get an even taper to this point, and again, bit of pencil like that. One flat push stroke, not contacting here, contacting here and here. So again, this is important if you have a flat file. If you don't have a flat file, then get yourself a ruler. Put the ruler on the piece and check for light coming underneath the ruler across. So put a light source behind the piece and the ruler, and if you see light, then you take away where the ruler is sitting. So I can see that I just have a little bit more material at this tip to take out, sneaking up on that area of no contact. There we go. I'll do the file check again. If I do perfectly sideways scratches, I don't even need the pencil because I can push along like that. And now I'm contacting the full surface. So, now that I've established a full flat, I can now go to draw filing, which is the first stage in getting true flatness by hand. So we're going to chalk up our file again. Note that most files are made for right-handed users. The teeth are angled at a 30-degree angle towards the right, so coming from left to right, they're angled out. And that means that when you're holding it in your right hand at a slight angle, the teeth are pretty much perpendicular to your work. If you're going to draw file, you don't want to be pushing with the tang in your right hand. And the reason for that is because at that point, the teeth are actually facing away from the work. All right, so if I was to pull on this, the teeth would be dragging over rather than cutting in. So if you're draw filing, put the tang in your left hand. If you're push filing, which is a technique, it's not normally used in many situations, but sometimes you're in an awkward situation. If you're push filing, you want it in your right hand. But in this case, because I'm right-handed and because I'm pull filing, I'm draw filing, I'm going to have the tang in my left hand, and I'm going to draw the file towards me. And what we should start to see is, there we go, you should be able to see it now. You can see here, there's this nice bright shiny bit that goes right down the center, but the sides have not been touched. And that's because this machinist's file is perfectly flat, but this material is not. And so just using this draw filing technique, we're going to get very close to true flatness. And it doesn't take very long at all. One thing you don't want to do is try and chase the low spots. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see. Yep, you can. There's a low spot here and a low spot there. If I was to angle the file and try and follow that, what would end up happening is I'd create another rounded surface. So I want to stick with my flat plane and let it come down to the level of those low spots. And that way we'll have one even plane. And obviously, because I wasn't really focused when I was doing this, I've cut it a bit deeper than I needed to. So I'll come back when I've got this all flat. Okay, so I've achieved what flatness I can with the rough bastard file. So this is a pretty rough cut bastard file. But while it is observationally flat, it is also very rough. It is ribbed by the teeth of the file. And while it's a nice even finish, it's not as smooth or as shiny as I'd like it. Now we could go to stage 3 at this stage, but what we're going to do is go to stage 2, which is to refine the draw filing with a finer file. And this is exactly the same process, tang in the left hand, and just drawing across the piece. Now, a quick trick for finding out if you've drawn through all of the previous scratches is to draw file at a slight angle. This will ultimately reveal to you if your draw filing was adequate, which mine, it appears, was not entirely. But that's okay, because that's what this is for. So, I'm going to draw file with this second cut bastard file. It's a second cut, double cut file. And then we will go to the finest file I have. And then we will go to the final finishing step of making this truly flat. So for this next step, it's actually easier to use on small pieces. So guard stock, blades, ricassos, that kind of thing. So I'm going to cut this section from the bar. Whew. There we go. So now we have our piece ready for final flattening. Okay, so we've come to final flattening. And for final flattening, you definitely need a surface plate. This is a faux marble tile for kitchens, and they're normally true to within a few thousandths over a square meter. So they're pretty much as dead flat as you're ever going to need as a knife maker. You can buy granite engineer's surface plates, which are true to within 1,000th. They're a little bit overkill for most things. And if you can't find a tile, granite tile like this, preferably one with a polished surface, or a piece of actual marble tabletop or something, plate glass or float glass is as true flat as you will need. So piece of plate glass from a local workshop or something like that is going to be perfect for this, and it's really, really handy around the shop for many different purposes, but this one specifically. The second thing is that some people will have a habit of grabbing their paper, putting it on the surface plate like that, and then going to town trying to do this. But what happens is that the paper bunches away from the surface. There's a little glue on this, but bunches away from the surface, just the tiniest amount on the edges. And what ends up happening is you end up doming your surface ever so slightly. And that's not what we want. So you use a spray adhesive. This is generic spray adhesive from a craft store. You can use Super 77 from 3M. There are various available. And get one that's redistributable, I believe it's called, repositionable. Spray adhesive, which means that you can mount something and then take it off. So I've just sprayed a light coat and then stuck this down, and I'll be able to peel that off easily afterwards. Doesn't matter if the edges lift off a little bit, because we're only going to be using the center. So we're going to grab our freshly hand flattened piece with file, and this is 400 grit, and I've finished with a hand smooth. If you have finished with a bastard file, then you'd want to start with something like 80 grit or 120 grit or 180 grit. But the finer a file finish you can get, the higher the grit you can start with off the bat. Of course, we want to lubricate. Because we've got a glue that is based on, it's petroleum based, we want to use water or Windex, or a Windex rip-off brand for our lubricant. And basically we're going to place the piece on the sandpaper. And you can see there's a little bit of rock in that, and that's because it's not truly flat. But what we don't want to do is impart unequal pressure on the piece, because as you sand, if you're pinching it here and you're doing this piece here will not be getting sanded, whereas this piece will. You want equal pressure. The same thing goes if you lean the piece to one side. If you're putting too much pressure on one side rather than the other, you're going to end up turning the piece. You're going to end up sanding away one side more than the other, and you're going to end up with non-parallel surfaces if you've already paralleled them up. With hand sanding like this, it's quite easy because you only need very light pressure, and you're just going to go in circles. And I occasionally shift my point of pressure to make sure that I'm not imparting pressure where I don't need to. On smaller pieces, this is even easier because you can just put pressure directly on the piece. Now, here we are, and I've started the sanding process. I'm going to bring this closer. And you can see that the sandpaper is only contacting this surface and this surface. Now, I believe, so this surface here was the one that was closest to the bar where we barely touched it with the file. This surface here is the end, and because when we were draw filing, we were naturally swooping our cuts, that's going to create a slight concavity to the surface. And that's where this comes in. But what I'm happy to see is that we're touching mostly across the full surface. There's a little bit in the center here. So again, I'm going to turn the camera and zoom in a little. We're just going to put it on there and start sanding. And this can take a while. This is the long version of how to make things flat. But it's just as effective as machine flattening. It creates just as flat a surface. And in many cases, in engineering, they will utilize hand lapping to create the flattest surfaces they can, because a machine can't always create flat surfaces. Now, if you're going to do push-pull strokes like this, you need to be very careful, because the natural inclination is to put more pressure this way when you're pushing, and more pressure that way when pulling. And so that means that you'll be pulling this way and pushing that way, and creating a rounded surface. So you want to have even downward pressure when you do the push-pull. But it's just as viable as the circles. The thing is that circles allow you to cover all the bases, and it's never going to rock in one specific direction. Okay, so I had to break for dinner, but we've completed the lapping of this piece. Now, this is actually a learning experience for myself as well. If you rush things, you can make mistakes. And here, I've actually rounded out the surface so much that it would take me hours to flatten this properly by lapping with 400 grit. I actually ended up getting some 240 grit just to make this a little bit faster. And I still haven't managed to get rid of that. But for examination purposes, this is fine. This is as close to truly flat as you need as a knife maker, a 400 grit finish. And if I turn it so that you can see a reflection, you can see that the reflection is not distorted in any way. There's no rounding. You can read letters in it. And that is going to give you the idea of what actual flatness looks like. If you were to turn a 400 grit finished piece like that, normally, you would normally see quite a bit of deformation. If it was concave, then you would see everything shrunk down smaller. If it was convex, everything would be slightly larger and it would ripple across the surface. But this is as truly flat as we need. Now, is this machinist flat? Is this, tolerances of, nanometers? Absolutely not. Especially given that it's only a 400 grit finish, you're probably looking, even if this granite or this mock granite tabletop is true to within a couple thousand nanometers, then this would still be way out, because I wasn't using the proper lapping technique, and it's quite a large surface area for hand lapping. But normally you wouldn't be working with something this big when you're hand lapping. You would be working with the size of a ricasso, which would be about half that size, if not less. Or the front of a guard, which maybe is slightly less than this, slightly less than half of that. So a lot of the time, you're not going to need to put this much effort in. And had I taken a little bit more time with my draw filing and actually done it properly, made sure that I was checking for flatness with that pencil trick or with a Sharpie or some die chem, then I would have got a much better result much faster. But the last thing to show you is what true flatness looks like when mated to another surface. So I'm going to cut this in half and we'll come back. So I hand lapped these again after cutting them, just because there's a little bit of irregularity from the cut. And they're now as flat as you can get them with 400 grit paper. You can see that the surface is quite uneven, but again, if I turn it, we get that nice clean reflection. Now, if I was to sit these two together like this, their mating surfaces are so close together that no matter where I turn it and how I turn it, you will never see light between them. The other thing that will show its flatness is if I wet the surface slightly. It's probably a little too much, but you'll get the idea. And meet them, I can lift the other block. Now it's quite heavy for such a small surface area to lift, but you can see that is so flat that it's creating a vacuum. If I hold it level, it actually stays on longer, but holding it level is the hard part. But you can see that it's simply the flatness of the surfaces that is holding those two together. There you go. So, hopefully that helps with you attaining flatness. So there you have it, flatness. Now, flatness is incredibly important in knife making, as I've already said, but it's also important to have parallel surfaces. If there's enough interest in this video, I may make a video on parallel and how to make parallel surfaces by hand and with machine. My next video, next week, will be how to make flat surfaces using machinery, so grinders and stuff like that. We're not going to be talking about mills, and we're not going to be talking about surface grinders, because those are things that most people don't have. I will touch on them, but we'll get there. Hopefully this has helped you understand how to attain flatness, but you have to keep in mind that we're not talking about moving parts. If you're making folders, like folding knives and stuff like that, flatness becomes even more important because those actions rely on flatness and parallelness. But when it comes to fixed blades, the majority of the time, the biggest things you're going to have to worry about with flatness are the fronts of your guards and the sides of your ricasso. In some cases, you may be worried about the sides of your blade, but not always, because you're going to have convex grind and stuff like that. But flatness is something that's important to know how to do well, because when you need it, you really need it. And if you want to get those really super nice Mastersmith style finishes and those really nice fit-ups, this is something that you have to master, and it's not that hard. With hand tools, it takes a little time, it takes a little effort, but you can attain better flatness than a person who's just using a belt grinder, 100% of the time. You can attain better flatness with hand lapping than you can with most CNC machines. Hand lapping is actually used in most engineering circles to provide within 30,000 nanometers of accuracy, which is infinitesimally small. But with that being said, I'm going to jump off now. I've got more work to do in the shop so that I can get more content out for you guys and for my wonderful patrons who I'm going to list here. These guys keep my channel running. They are the rock upon which I stand in these stormy seas that is the current year. And they're fantastic people, and I love every single one of them. And if you want to join this group of fantastic people and have access to all kinds of behind-the-scenes content, including more deep dives like this, then please feel free to check out Patreon. My Patreon is linked down in the description. And also, while you're down there, why not hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for new videos that come out every Wednesday. I also have live streams at 9 a.m. Australian Western Standard Time on every Saturday. With that being said, I hope you take time to get out to your shop, make something awesome, and have fun while you're doing it. Have a good one, guys.